started. I am Kirby Lambert. I'm the Program Manager for Outreach and Interpretation here at the Historical Society. This is Jennifer Bottomley O'Looney, who is our Senior Curator of Art. Hopefully, by now you've all heard that we've recently written a catalog of our Russell collection, and that is what we're talking about today. Today is technically a book release party, and in reality it's turned into a book plate release party. The books didn't show up, but they'll be here, and we trust that you'll find them worth the wait. But I think Jennifer and I are going to take turns talking different aspects of Russell and his career, and so I guess we'll just jump right into it. Because we're historians, we always feel like we have to start at the beginning, because where else would you start? And in this case, that is the year 1864, 150 years ago. In that year, three things happened that ultimately merged together to bring us all here today. In Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln signed legislation that created Montana Territory out of the eastern half of Idaho Territory. In the frontier settlement of Bannock, the first territorial legislature passed legislation that would eventually result in the creation of the Montana Historical Society. Our actual anniversary date is February of 1865, but we got our beginnings in 1864. And in St. Louis, a child was born to a prominent family who was, quote, sturdily built and as blonde as a Swede. Charlie was born in St. Louis, Missouri on March 19, 1864, and in spite of the cowboy persona that he would later project, the Russell family was actually well-established and well-connected. Along with his siblings and numerous cousins, Russell spent most of his rambunctious childhood at Oak Hill, a former plantation which by his time was evolving into a suburb of St. Louis. Charlie's mom, Mary, was universally regarded as pious, warm, and devout. She was the daughter of a highly regarded jeweler and silversmith and an accomplished amateur artist in her own right. It was she who encouraged the Russell children in artistic and creative pursuits. And Charlie's dad, Charles Silas Russell, helped manage the family's many commercial concerns, which included a clay quarry and a fire brick and tile-making firm, which played a significant role in the industrial development of St. Louis. If Russell inherited his artistic inclinations from his mother, he inherited a love of reading from his father. And although he was never a good student or successful academically, he did love to read the leather-stocking tales of James Fenimore Cooper, the Ned Buntline stories and other dime novels, and other Western lore. According to Russell biographer John Tolliver, it would be impossible to overestimate the effect of such books on Charlie's development. In addition to dime novels that fueled the young artist's fascination with the West, Charlie also heard stories at home from his paternal grandmother, who was a Bent. And the Bents played a notable role, and sometimes violent role, in the development of the Southwest. Among other activities, they established Bent's Fort in present-day Colorado in 1833. And for most of its 16-year existence, the fort played a crucial role in expanding the fur trade across the region and in the commercial success of the Santa Fe Trail. In addition to these dime novels and the family lore that he heard at home, the bustling St. Louis waterfront served as an irresistible lure for the would-be mountain man. As Charlie's wife, Nancy, would later recall, his teachers gave him up because he could not be made to study. The levee of his hometown, however, had an irresistible fascination for the lad. He played hooky, Nancy noted, and the hours he should have been in school, he spent at the riverfront, watching and talking with all sorts of men, unconsciously starting to build the foundation for his life's work. Finally, after an unsuccessful stint at military boarding school back east, Charlie's parents yielded to his persistent pleading that he be allowed to venture west. They hoped that the reality of life on a harsh frontier would end his daydreaming and he'd return happily to St. Louis and the family business. They were, however, wrong. Never again would Russell call any place but Montana home. Charlie left Missouri in the spring of 1880. He was just shy of his 16th birthday. He traveled with Pike Miller, a friend of his father's, who owned a ranch in the Judith Basin. They traveled by train to Utah, then stagecoach to Helena. They stayed in the capital city only long enough to stock up on supplies before setting out for the Judith Basin, a horseback trip which took them 3 weeks. Much to the young adventurer's dismay, upon arriving at Miller's ranch, he was given the job of herding sheep, a job not to his liking. As Russell later put it, "I lost those sheep quicker than Miller could replace them." The two quarreled, and after only a short stint, Charlie left Miller's employ abruptly, provisioned with only his bedroll, mare, and pack horse. Fortunately for the impetuous youth, his path soon crossed with that of Jake Hoover, a hunter, trapper, prospector, and all-around mountain man, 32 years old and already well steeped in the ways of the frontier. Hoover's cabin, which would serve as Charlie's next home, was located on the South Fork of the Judith River. Russell described it as, quote, "shut off from the outside world, a hunter's paradise, bounded by walls of mountains from the outside world. Walls of mountains where nature had surely done her best, and no king of the old times could have claimed a more beautiful and bountiful domain." Although accounts differ on the specifics of the time that he spent with Hoover, all agree that the mountain man played a pivotal role in Russell's transition into a true Montanan. In May 1882, Russell was hired as a nighthawk for the Judith Basin Spring Roundup. Roundups were annual features of the open range ranching in which the cattle that had been wintered over en masse were separated according to owner. The nighthawk's job was to tend the horse herds, letting them feed but not stray, while the other cowboys slept. For the next 11 years, Russell supported himself by working as a wrangler during the spring and fall roundups, and then foraging as best he could to make it through the winter. He was never, however, a particularly adept hand. "I am not what other people think a cowboy should be," Charlie later admitted. "I was neither a good roper nor rider, but I worked the big outfits and always held my job." So there's clearly more to Charlie's story than this, but we can't really talk about his development as an artist without talking about his wife, Nancy. So I'm going to stop for a minute and let Jennifer take over, and we'll come back to Nancy in just a second.
Thanks, Kirby. As noted by William Cameron in this quote, Russell was a master of a wide variety of artistic media, and we're fortunate that the artworks in the Society's collection illustrate the breadth and depth of his genius in terms of both development as an artist and his ability to master these different media. As a boy, Russell's imagination was fired by the books he read, the tales he heard, and the works of other artists whom he studied. After coming to Montana, his artistic vision would be fueled by his own experience, coupled by his love of his adopted state. The earliest drawings in the collection are rough pencil sketches, only slightly improved artistically from those in his boyhood sketchbook. For the most part, they were created to document a particular place or event and given away as souvenirs. These drawings are executed in pencil, the easiest material for an itinerant cowboy to carry with him, on whatever paper he had on hand. Here's one example. In 1888, William and Atta Netta Long, who are residents of Philbrook, Montana, hired mountain man Jake Hoover to guide them on a hunting trip. Hoover's trip included help along the outing, a fiddler, a cook, and Russell, who drew this sketch for the Longs to document their adventures. And according to family lore, Mrs. Long was very style conscious and asked Russell to make sure that he depicted her with her French heels, which you can see there to the right. Among the most notable of the Society's holdings are the 24 oil paintings that form the vibrant core of its permanent collection of Russell art. Like many of these paintings, Men of the Open Range offers a realistic depiction of cowboy life in a bygone era. Riders set out at daybreak to begin a long day's work. They leave behind their cow camp, which is still visible in the far river below them. The white horse that dominates the center of the image has a blindfold attached to the bridle, and you can see red spur marks on its shoulders, a clear indication that the morning did not begin peacefully for the rider and his Greenbroke mount. Russell scholar Brian Dippy heralds this painting as, quote, perhaps Russell's supreme achievement in his later years, noting that the substantial foreground works to create an aura of monumentality. The painting conveys a splendid feeling of the land and light and freedom as the cowboys scatter at the start of a new day. Not all of Russell's paintings were executed on canvas or paper. Early in his career, a dearth of available supplies dictated a need for the young cowboy to paint on whatever material was on hand, from shoebox lids to bunkhouse walls. Even though the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in Montana in 1883 meant the provisions of all kinds, including art supplies, were more readily available, Russell continued to use non-traditional materials, ranging from birch bark to cement, when the notion struck him. And the most unusual canvas that's in our collection is this piece. It was done on a metal medallion that was originally a steel metal medallion that was originally on a bank vault door. Russell spent the winter of 1880 and 1881 in Lewistown, where he was commissioned to produce 2 oil paintings for the Bank of Fergus County. And according to bank manager Wilford Johnson, this commission was timely. Charlie was trying to get through a hard winter. He was broke and had been drinking rather heavily and was desperately hard up, quote unquote. Charlie Russell's extraordinary artistic abilities surfaced at a very young age when he began modeling horses from flower-making wax that he pilfered from his sister, Susan, who later recalled that the young Charlie, quote, was always carried a chunk of wax in his pocket and modeled almost incessantly, unquote. Laura Edgar Whitmore, whose father ranched in the Judith Basin and who was Charlie's first love, recalled many years later that he could do almost the most amazing things without looking at them. A lump of clay worked in under the table would appear as a horse, a bear, or perhaps an Indian. He found a very smooth deposit of terracotta clay in the riverbank, she said, and this provided materials for figures and groups that could be found in many cabins up and down the valley. This tiny pig, no bigger than a pair of dice, is typical of many of the small sculptural pieces that Russell loved to make quickly and give to his friends. Charlie's nephew, Austin Russell, recounted, in his pants pockets, Charlie always had a lump of beeswax, mottled black from handling, and while he was talking, he would take it out and work it soft and model a pig or a buffalo or whatnot. And often pieces of this size would not survive because Russell was constantly manipulating the wax. And Austin wrote, he would look at it in an inquiring way, then mash it out with his thumb and make something else. So we're very lucky to have this little piece in our collection. In addition to the wondrous sights exhibited at the 1904 World's Fair, St. Louis was treated to the spectacular hit play, Ben-Hur. The show first ran on Broadway from November 1899 to May of 1900, and it was so popular that it was revived again in 1903 and then traveled across the country. In St. Louis, the play opened in October 1904 in the Olympic Theater, and featuring a cast of 350 players, a spectacle that included the interior of a Roman trireme, the Bacchanalian festivities of the Grove of Daphne, and the housetop of the Palace of Hur in Jerusalem, and the show-stopping race between 2 chariots powered by 8 live horses, all presented with accompanying music of the Olympic Orchestra, excuse me. Every performance at the Big Playhouse sold out, and additional matinee performances were added to assuage audience demand. And Nancy and Charlie were visiting St. Louis at this time while Russell was exhibiting several of his works at the fair, and they took his nephew, Austin, to see the show. And Austin later recalled, he took me to see Ben-Hur in the famous chariot race, and afterward he modeled me a quadriga, a 4-horse chariot mounted on a block of wood, and he painted and gilded. It had lots of action, but the horses were right off the range and ran with their heads up and their tails flagged in a manner most unclassical. And I should say that as part of doing the research for this book, we discovered a lot of things, and for the longest time, we did not have this connection of the play Ben-Hur we came across as far as doing the research. We just had this fun little model and thought that's what it was, and then we made the connection with the research. So we made a lot of great discoveries in this journey. In addition to crafting models to entertain friends and other onlookers, or as to give as gifts, Charlie often created sculptures to aid him with composition, shadow, and lighting in his paintings. His cousin, Fergus Mead, recalled, Charlie used to keep a hunk of plasticine on his painting stand, and when he'd get stuck on a painting of a face, he'd model the head and then paint from the little clay model, holding it in the position that would light it as he wanted. Although somewhat time-worn, Russell's fingerprints can still be seen painted in the wax of this carefully modeled figure, especially around the area of the forearm of the writer. XT bar longhorn. By the turn of the century, Russell had developed a keen interest in casting small figures of plaster in multiple copies that he would then hand paint. He admired a longhorn steer owned by Christopher Dickinson and then modeled this steer as a gift to him. He portrayed the reclining longhorn with the XT bar brand prominently displayed on its left ribs. He was fascinated by longhorns, which he called greyhounds wearing horns. And he said they were sure a surprise to those old cow ponies that had been running short horns all their life. Smoking Up was the first sculpture that Russell had cast into bronze. He made the original wax model in 1904 while on a visit to New York City and sold it to the New York Cooperative Society, which had the piece cast by the Roman Bronze Works. It depicts a raucous cowboy riding a rearing horse, whooping and hollering and shooting his gun in the air, smoking it up after spending his wages in a local watering hole. One of his favorite subjects, Russell repeatedly immortalized buffalo in clay, wax, and paint. Though the vast herds that had once filled the plains were gone by the time Russell first came to Montana, they held an abiding fascination for him. Robert F. Morgan, the Society's curator emeritus, summed up Russell's passion for the buffalo. No one before or since has caught the majesty of these shaggy beasts on the vast prairies. An American cattle was the first of Russell's bronzes that served as a utilitarian means as well as a sculptural. It could be used as bookends. And although Russell's bronzes are quite wonderful, he himself preferred the original models, the painted plasters over bronzes. Perhaps because, as his nephew Austin recalled, Charlie loved to model but was never satisfied with the bronze castings. He wanted more detail, which he felt bronze did not adequately capture. But since bronze is sold for more than plaster casts, however, his wife Nancy recognized the financial benefits to be gained from this medium, and it was she who encouraged and assisted him in this pursuit. And this shows bronzes from the home in Pasadena that Nancy lived in after his death.
So that brings us back to Nancy, and although it's certainly now a cliche to say behind every man or behind every successful man there stands a woman, but in the Russell's case, it's totally true. In 1895, 2 years after Russell gave up cowboying to devote his full attention to art, he went to dinner at the home of his friends Ben and Leela Roberts in Cascade. The Roberts had working for them a young girl named Nancy Cooper, and Charlie came to dinner one night and met Nancy. Charlie was immediately taken with Nancy, and she was immediately taken with him. Nancy later wrote, "The picture that is engraved on my memory is of a man a little above average height and weight, wearing a soft shirt, a Stetson hat on the back of his blonde head, tight trousers held up by a half-breed sash that clung just above his hip bones, high-heeled riding boots on very small arched feet. He had gray-blue, deep-set eyes that seemed to see everything, but with an expression of honesty and understanding. His hands were good-sized, perfectly shaped, with long, slender fingers. He loved jewelry and always wore 3 or 4 rings. They would not have been Charlie's hands any other way. Everyone noticed his hands, but it was not the rings that attracted, but the artistic, sensitive hands that had great strength and charm. The following year, the couple married in the Roberts home in Cascade, and in 1897, they relocated permanently to Great Falls. Nancy, or Mame, as Russell always called her, was in many ways Charlie's opposite. He was born into wealth and privilege and willingly gave up his social standing that was his by birthright. Nancy was born into poverty and fought throughout her life to better her situation. Charlie valued friendship above all else, caring little how others, especially polite society, viewed him, and Nancy, on the other hand, was driven by a need to be accepted by the proper elements of society, a need that no doubt resulted from her early hardships. Charlie came from a close, solid, close-knit family. Nancy did not. Before marrying Nancy, Charlie's transition from cowboy to artist was not an easy one. He had trouble with alcohol, and he had always been uncomfortable with the business transactions required to sell his art for enough money to make a living. Nancy, as it turned out, was not. Soon after moving to Great Falls, Charlie received a commission from the mayor's wife. When it was completed, Nancy asked if she could deliver the small watercolor. Russell agreed, but cautioned his wife not to ask for more than $25. She came home with $35. Thereafter, with Russell's encouragement, she took control of the business aspects of his career. As Montana poet Greystone Coates observed, Russell didn't want to run after moneyed people to buy his pictures, and Nancy wanted to cash in on her husband's talent. Both were right, so there. Or, as Charlie himself summed up their relationship for a newspaper reporter in 1925, "We are partners. She is the business end, and I am the creative. She lives for tomorrow, and I live for yesterday. So it is the combination which brings today." Art for Nancy was business, and she left nothing to chance. As noticed by Russell scholar Brian Dippy, in addition to locating willing galleries and working with their owners, Nancy had to be resourceful in organizing advance publicity, getting stories planted in local papers where Charlie was exhibiting, and holding up her end in business negotiations over commissions, copyrights, and prices for direct sales. While we frequently marvel at Russell's ability as a self-taught artist, I think we also need to appreciate the fact that Nancy truly excelled at her own craft, one in which she was also entirely self-educated. Under her able management, Russell's audiences grew in ever-widening circles, and Nancy was able to obtain ever-increasing prices for his work. Within a few short years, she was demanding and receiving thousands of dollars for his oil paintings, sums Charlie himself viewed as, quote, dead men's prices. In addition to courting individual collectors, Nancy also arranged exhibitions of his works in such distant venues as Calgary, Winnipeg, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and even London. Of all these, however, none played a greater role in furthering his career than did his first one-man show in New York City. Mounted at the prestigious Folsom Gallery in 1911, the exhibit captured the attention not only of patrons, but fellow artists and critics as well. Nancy's success as Charlie's business manager did not come without a price. To Charlie, nothing was more important than his old cohorts. Nancy, on the other hand, viewed the time that Charlie spent with such friends as a hindrance to his success. Consequently, unlike Charlie, who was made welcome and felt at home anywhere in Montana, Nancy was never fully accepted in Great Falls. She was snubbed by society women for her humble origins and greatly resented by Charlie's rougher cronies because of her efforts to limit access to their old friend. This is my personal favorite picture of Nancy. I think she looks like somebody you don't really want to mess with. So, here's an example in Charlie's art that kind of reflects the difference between Charlie and Russell. This paired drawing, so when the couple got married in 1896, Charlie's friends from the Silver Dollar Saloon in Great Falls all pitched in and bought them a silver tea service. Russell sent this paired set of drawings as a thank you to his friends. And you can see the tea service in use in the second sketch. But because Nancy refused to befriend Charlie's rowdier friends, however, the givers of the tea set would never be invited into her home to use it. Even though many of Charlie's friends strongly disliked Nancy, he's actually the one who gets to have the last say on this subject. Late in life, Charlie summarized the significance of Nancy's impact on his art and his life when he told a reporter, "My wife has been an inspiration to my work. Without her, I would probably have never attempted to soar or reach any height further than to make a few pictures for my friends and old acquaintances. I still love and long for the Old West, and everything that goes with it, but I would sacrifice it all for Mrs. Russell.
The fact that Russell did truly love and long for the Old West is readily apparent in his artwork, and the Society's collection fully represents the central themes to which the cowboy artist devoted his career, for which he's so well known. First and foremost of these themes, of course, was that of the life of the open-range cowpuncher. The Circle Diamond brand in this example belonged to the Bloom Cattle Company, which was headquartered in Trinidad, Colorado. Note the errant cow was branded when it was quite small, and the brand has grown in size as the cow grew older. The subject shown here was one that Russell was very familiar with, having depicted an ornery bunking bronc in paintings a number of times. Probably one of the best known is Bronc to Breakfast. Russell left no written word documenting the inspiration for this painting, so it might have been a particular event, or it might just be Russell retelling a common cowboy yarn. Charlie depicts himself seated on the right with a plate of food, watching the twisting bronc kick the morning coffee, the bacon-filled frying pan, and the Dutch oven biscuits into the fire. Finding humor in such events is a hallmark of many of Russell's works. However, he never wished to see anyone harmed. A friend who was a fellow cowboy on the range with Russell recounted, he got a kick out of anything that happened as long as no one was injured. He was the most scared fellow I ever saw when there was the least chance of anyone getting hurt. If a fellow got thrown off a bucking horse, Charlie would actually turn white until the rider got on his feet again, and then he'd hightail it to get a pencil and paper and draw the comic picture of it happening. Another of the artist's favorite themes was the passing of the frontier. Although Russell's art is now synonymous with the open-range cattle ranching, when he was a young boy growing up in St. Louis, the Mountain Man was the first frontier character to fuel Charlie's interest in the West. Painted when Charlie was at the height of his career artistically, Free Trapper pays homage to the idealized figures of his youth, the adventurous men who traveled the early West as independent agents working for themselves rather for the one of the fur trading companies. Another subject that Russell loved to portray was the traditional lifeways of Montana's First Peoples. In fact, he portrayed Native Americans more than any other subject matter. Indian Hunters Returns captures the excitement and relief that greet a small party of blood hunters as they return to camp at dusk, bringing the buffalo meat and the hides that mean the survival for their families. Their painted teepees have been situated in the river bottom, nestled among leafless cottonwoods to help provide protection from the harsh winter winds. The orange glow of day's end, along with the presence of European trade goods, you see colorful blankets in a metal pot lying in the snow beneath the cooking tripod, foreshadow the coming demise of their traditional ways of life. Malcolm McKay's son, Bill, recalled that visitors to their New Jersey home sometimes commented that the beauty of the pictures was spoiled for them by the inclusion of dogs lapping at the blood that seeps from the dead animals. When informed of this criticism, Russell's response was, according to Bill, "Tell him that's the way it was, and I'm not going to change it." The earliest oil paintings in the Montana Historical Society's collection are devoted to Native American subjects. Russell certainly encountered Indians during his early years in Montana, but his first significant interaction with Native peoples occurred in Canada in the summer of 1888. In search of adventure, Russell traveled north to the High River area of Alberta with his friends Phil Weinard and B.J. Longgreen Stillwell. Weinard, who had recently been married, had already secured a job as a ranch hand before leaving Montana, but Russell and Stillwell arrived too late to find summer employment. And as Russell described his situation in a letter to a friend back home, he said, "I'm staying at a cattle ranch on the High River. I'm not doing anything now as I got here too late for the roundup. I like the country pretty well so far. There's lots of Indians here, and they visit us nearly every day." When Russell returned to Montana at the end of that summer, he left Phil with a pen and ink sketch of Abskinus, a member of the Blood tribe, who, according to historian Hugh Dempsey, was Russell's principal informant during the artist's visit to Alberta in 1888. When Russell met Abskinus, Dempsey wrote, he was everything the artist might hope for. He was from a strong warrior tradition, knowledgeable about the customs of his tribe, able to speak passable English, and living in the traditional way. And clearly, this sketch served as a study for the oil painting Portrait of an Indian. Aspects of Plains Indian domestic life, such as women moving camp, offered a frequently revisited theme for Russell. These scenes typically featured a small group of women and children mounted on horseback, pulling a travois loaded with their family's possessions. Paintings such as Moving Out illustrates Russell's regard for and an understanding of the traditional nomadic lifeways of Plains Indians, who moved camp according to the dictates of the season, seeking sheltered valleys in the winter and following sources of food, buffalo and other games, as well as ripening plants and berries at other times of the year. Women performed most tasks associated with these moves, freeing the men to ride unencumbered so that they could scout for game and search for signs of enemies or other trouble. Now, so well known was Russell for focusing on these Western themes. A woman interested in Russell's work once wrote Nancy, "If Charlie ever painted a painting that did not have Indians, cowboys, or violence in it, she'd be interested in purchasing it." And Nancy did eventually sell her a painting of a buffalo. Russell did paint other subjects. For example, we have Lolly. History documents two great romances in Russell's life. The second was Nancy Cooper Russell, of his wife of 30 years. His first love, however, was Laura Edgar, whose father was a prominent St. Louis merchant who for a time also operated a sheep ranch in Montana's Judith Basin. Lolly, as she was affectionately known, spent the school years at St. Louis but returned every summer to her family's ranch, where she and Russell, who was 4 years her senior, were thrown together constantly. Many years later, Laura recalled, "One year, I went back to school in St. Louis, a little girl in short skirts and hair down my back. The winter changed all that. I came home with my hair put up and my skirts long, and Charlie liked this change, and he told me so. When we had been comrades before, we became sweethearts. We were sure our romance was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened, and it would never die." Understandably, Laura's parents were less than enthusiastic about the budding romance between their young daughter and the itinerant cowboy. When in 1886 the Edgar family sold their ranch and returned permanently to St. Louis, Russell was brokenhearted, as evidenced by this portrait, which he painted more than half a decade after the couple's paths diverged. Russell did not quickly forget Laura. And this painting is also very atypical for Russell, is believed to have been created for a candy booth that Leela Roberts set up at a fundraiser for a church social in Cascade, sometime between 1896 and 1897. Russell and Nancy married in Cascade in 1896, and it is thought that she and her friends talked him into contributing this watercolor to the effort. Both Leela and her husband, Ben Roberts, were close friends of the Russells, and the Roberts' home is where Russell first met Nancy and where they were married. Additionally, Montana's wildlife provided abiding subject matter for the artists. The natural world that, in spite of the numerous changes wrought by progress over the past century and a half, continued to play a central role. In 1905, Charlie and Nancy bought a lot on the shores of Lake McDonald, near the community of Apgar, in what would 5 years later become Glacier National Park. They built a cabin and christened it Bullhead Lodge in honor of Charlie's signature buffalo skull. Beginning in 1906, they spent every summer in the park, always accompanied by hosts of friends and relatives. In 1912, he wrote fellow artist and good friend Phil Goodwin, "We spent 2 months at the lake and had a pretty good time. The deer are getting very tame since shooting is barred. Several times they came right into the front of the cabin. I put salt in the trail and they came often to lick." Glacier was close in physical distance to Great Falls, but worlds away in terms of scenery, flora, and fauna, and Russell loved both. In 1926, shortly after what would prove to be his last visit to Bullhead Lodge, he wrote, "We have just returned from our mountain camp where the big hills look very beautiful in their fall clothing of many colors. When it comes to making the beautiful, Ma Nature has man beat all ways from the ace, and the old lady still owns a lot of Montana." The photographs depict Charlie and Nancy on the porch of Bullhead Lodge with guests and picnicking on the shores of Lake McDonald. Russell drew the sketch of Bullhead Lodge on the top right in one of the privacy screens. You can see on the very top right the lodge. The screens were used as room dividers and as guest registers in the cabin. One of Charlie's favorite wildlife subjects was bears. This model of honey hunters portrays a mother bear and her cubs climbing a tree. The bears are modeled in dark brown wax, and the tree is made of smooth, weathered pine limb. The mother bear is perched near the top of the tree, listening for danger, while the two cubs frolic below her. Rangefather features a wild stallion chasing down a wolf. The wolf runs flat out on it with its tail between its legs in a desperate attempt to escape the steed, who's protecting his brood. Russell held the wild horse in great regard, and he deplored the practice of culling vast numbers of wild horses for the plains. He wrote, "Some people have forgotten that the range horse helped make this country. All gold and silver was discovered with cayuses. Any old-timer that ships horses to butchers is worse than a cannibal."
So I think it's an understatement to say that not everyone, then or now, is lucky enough to own an original Russell or even be able to see one. So in addition to the sale of original artworks, Charlie's reputation grew as an illustrator of books and magazines. And not only did this bring in needed income, but more importantly, it enabled Russell to develop a nationwide following. Publications showcasing his images, starting with local advertisements and calendars like this one, spread Russell's fame in ways that original artworks alone could not. While some of the pen sketches, the Society has many pen sketches in our collection. Some were completed for other purposes, but most were produced to illustrate stories published in magazines, books, and newspapers. Many of these were commissioned for works authored by nationally famous writers, like Owen Wister, author of The Virginian, while others were commissioned by Russell's good friends, like Malcolm McKay and Frank Bird Linderman. Linderman was a kindred spirit to Russell, came from the East, did a variety of jobs when he got to Montana, but eventually became best known as a writer of Indian lore, teller of Indian folktales, and Russell illustrated several of his books. I need to quit doing that. His good friend and one of his primary patrons, Malcolm McKay, in 1925 wrote a memoir of his time called Cow Range and Hunting Trail. Talks about his experiences as a rancher in Montana and a hunter in Alaska. And Russell did 4 original illustrations for that book. This is another example of a book that Russell illustrated. It was written by John H. Beacom. It's called How the Buffalo Lost His Crown. And this recounts a Blackfeet legend that explained how man, with assistance from his animal friends, gained the upper hand over the buffalo who, from the beginning of time, had ruled all other creatures. The publication featured 8 illustrations commissioned from Russell, including 1 black and white oil painting and 5 black and white sketches and watercolors. This sketch is actually not in the book. It is an original depiction of Indian talking to beaver and fox, 2 of the central characters in the narrative, and it's one of 2 illustrations that Russell added to his own copy of the book. But Russell not only illustrated works by other writers, he also was an unequaled storyteller in his own right, and his skill as a storyteller in both word and picture reached its apogee with the publication of his illustrated Rawhide Rollins stories, which began appearing in Montana newspapers in 1916. In that year, the Montana Newspaper Association, which was co-owned by Russell's good friend Percy Rayban, began featuring occasional cowboy yarns in its weekly supplements that were distributed to smaller newspapers statewide. These yarns were written by Russell, but were narrated by a fictitious cowboy named Rawhide Rollins. In 1921, the Newspaper Association published Rawhide Rollins Stories, an anthology of 17 of these tales, followed in 1925 by a sequel, More Rawhides. At the time of his death, Russell was working on a third book, Trails Plowed Under, which was finished by Nancy and published in 1927. These books all proved to be immensely popular for the same reason that Russell's art was. They told tales of the West's colorful history in terms that were both appealing and accessible to the people who lived that life or the people who wished they had. For example, this image accompanies a story which reads in part, "In the spring, cowmen came to a set meeting place with their riders. The roundup captain had to know all the brands and the country. When they all met, these folks started working the country for calves. When the punchers were all saddled, the whole bunch left camp. The captain rode out with his bunch and did what's called scattering his riders. As I said before, these cowboys know the range, and they know where the most cows are, so the captain sends his riders according. The sun ain't up yet when they scatter, and maybe they're all back by noon, bringing lots of cows and calves. They're all thrown into one big herd. Maybe there's 1,000 head. Now all these riders, barring a few that's left to hold the herd, go to camp for dinner." And of course, so many of these stories display Russell's hallmark sense of humor. This one goes with the story that Con Price and a friend of his, Rosser, are out riding when they see a cabin that looks like it has women living there, and this of course is a huge deal in a sparsely settled area where there are no women. So they think about it and they decide that they want to meet these women, but they don't want to just like go up and knock on the door because that's too forward. So Con has the idea that he's going to pretend to get hurt by falling off his horse. So Russell writes, "Con's idea is to start him and then fall off. There may be 50 yards from the house when Con throws one of his hooks in the shoulder of the old hoss, hoping somebody's looking from behind a curtain to see the fall he gets. Once is enough. The animal, like many of his kind, considers this an insult, and sinking his head, he starts for the clouds. About the third jump, Con loosens and lays on the ground like he's hurt real bad. Rosser quits his hoss and runs to his friend, and he's got all he can do to get him up on his feet. 'You're sure enough an actor,' Rosser whispers to Con. 'You're as heavy as a dead bear,' he says, as he leads him and packs him up the hill to the house. They might have got sympathy from the ladies in response to Con's accident, but it turns out that there are no ladies home. So, well, they might have got sympathy from these ladies. They don't get none from one another. This play of theirs turns into a hoss joke, and of course nobody laughs but the hosses. It's a 10-mile ride to the ranch, and it means twice that afoot to see these spur hill gents. Con laughs about it now, but Rosser says he never even smiled the day he walked. Rosser says Con had no license to kick. He fought hosses all his life and win most of the fights. That day he throws the fight to the hosses, the hoss being as crooked as Con double-crossed him."
Long before Russell was acclaimed as an artist or a published author, he was celebrated by those who knew him for his philosophy and wit. Coupled with Russell's humor was his generosity toward and his deep devotion to those whom he counted as his friends. The conviction that if he liked a friend, there was nothing he would not do for them was frequently echoed. And in describing the depth of his friendship for people, Nancy asserted, "Anyone who knew him at all loved him, and I don't know anyone who has as many friends as he had." Painted 1 year before his death, Laugh Kills Lonesome is one of the only 2 nocturnal paintings in the Society's Russell collection. It's also the most unabashedly nostalgic. Beleaguered by ill health and living in the 20th century West that continued to change in ways not to his liking, Russell's increasingly dwelt in the past. No painting better illustrates his mourning of a lost place, of the frontier that he loved, so much as this painting here, than Laugh Kills Lonesome. He includes himself in the painting, standing beside a favorite horse, just inside the firelight's glow. The DHS brand on the chuck wagon indicates it's part of the Davis, Hauser, and Stewart Cattle Company, an outfit which Charlie rode as a young man. And it was this youthful friendship that he made while night wrangling for the DHS and other brands that would remind him of remain the strongest throughout his life. And this piece, Charles M. Russell and His Friends, is almost 7 feet wide. Charlie made this as a gift to his good friend and patron Malcolm McKay, and it was created to hang above the family's fireplace in their Russell room in their Tenafly, New Jersey home. The painting, or as poster as Nancy called it, Russell placed himself prominently situated in the foreground on a hilltop, seated astride a horse, and he gestures with his left arm outstretched, inviting the viewer to meet his friends, both cowboys and Indians, who are riding up to greet him. The figures are set against a panoramic background composed of the Missouri River in the middle ground and Square Butte flanked by the Rocky Mountain front in the distant background. One early companion observed many years later on Charlie's likability. For when all is done and said, even if Charlie could not have painted any kind of picture, he would have been just as popular, for he was a good mixer and could reel all kinds of yarns, and that was something needed in cow country. And here we are with some of his good friends. For Russell fans today, nothing provides a more intimate glimpse of his personality than do his letters to his friends. Back then, nothing was more cherished by those lucky enough to receive one. Russell penned this letter to his good friend and saloon proprietor, Bill Rance, to thank him for his case of joy juice that he had sent to Bullhead Lodge for the Russells to use in entertaining their summer guests. Jokingly, Charlie indicated that he might sell the liquor instead. He wrote, "Most of the fellers I see up here don't look like Coca-Cola men. Catch one of these long, thirsty, leg-weary fishermen and with nothing but water to drink, and he'll buy red ink at your price and thank you for it. And with that high grade of joy juice of yours, Bill, I could have them riding home for money." In spite of the fact, as a younger man, Russell had a drinking problem and had given up alcohol himself, he didn't begrudge others imbibing. He did, however, resent booze fighters and other reformers and the changes they were trying to bring to Montana. During the winter of 1892 and 1893, Russell and 6 other friends, including Bill McDonough, batched together in a small cabin in Chinook, where provisions were extremely scarce. Russell's slim income from his art, along with occasional stolen chicken and rations obtained on credit, kept them fed. And in an effort to improve their financial lot, the Hungry Seven, as they were dubbed, attempted for a short time to run a saloon. And years later, Russell recalled his own questionable bartending skills. He wrote, "A stranger asked for a cocktail and I built one. It ought to have been a good. I put everything on the back bar in it, even that piece of lemon skin I had." He continues, he only took one swallow and left the house and was never seen afterward. Maybe he went to Milk River to put the fire out and got bogged down in the quicksand. The booze parlor didn't last long, 14 days. It was like a life of butterfly, short but a very merry one. Riding the goat was a ritual commonly used to initiate a member into the Elks Lodge, as well as many other fraternal lodges. While some fraternal groups used a mechanical reproduction goat, the Elks are believed to have used an actual goat for their ceremony. Here, the goat is saddled and branded with the head of an elk. You can see on its rear end there. And Charlie has just broke him. Charlie looks a little worse for wear. His hair and clothing are disheveled, and his Assumption sass has fallen awry, and the goat has trampled his hat. And this was presented to his fellow Elks in Great Falls after his initiation in March of 1908. In the spring of 1916, the Russells were once again in New York, where Charlie took the opportunity to regale Bill Rance and the bunch with his views on modern fashion. He writes here, "Maybe you think this lady's stripped for a bath, but you're wrong. She's at dinner. The evening garments of a female in this camp wouldn't pad a crutch. If clothing is a sign of civilization and paints spell heathen, judging from the she-folks, I'm among the savages." And in 1920, the Russells spent February through April in Southern California. It was the first of what would become an annual sojourn orchestrated by Nancy to escape Montana's harsh winters and spend time among fashionable crowds and potential. As always, Russell would have preferred to be home in Montana, but he did enjoy the opportunity to mingle with Western stars such as Tom Mix, Bill Hart, and Will Rogers, with whom he would become friends. But more often, he was amused or dumbfounded by the people he met or the sights he saw. And in this letter, he describes an excursion to the beach where he pictures himself in a bathing suit that highlights his protruding belly and white bandy legs. Russell observes, anytime you or any of your he or she start thinking you're losing the beauty lines that gave you youth, come to Long Beach and you'll feel better. Nobody's barred. Clothing is made to hide or lie, but bathing suits are truthful. And he goes on, for several years, old Dad Time had been handing me things I didn't want and ain't been thankful for his favors. But since I took a look at Long Beach, I think the old gent's been damn good to me.
Well, and that brings us pretty much to the conclusion of our talk. When Jennifer and I first started planning this, our goal was to tell you everything you ever needed to know about Charlie and our collection. Of course, we knew that wasn't really possible, so we thought we would narrow it down to the 10 things you most needed to know. And then, as we began working on that, it became apparent that all of that information would not fit into one talk. So we decided that there's only one solution, and that, of course, is for you to buy the book. We're a little thwarted in that because the book's not here, so you can't actually buy it, and we're sorry about that, but it's the way it goes sometimes. But we do hope you will come back and buy the book when it's here, or check it out from your local library, because we do think that Charlie is an incredibly special person, and we think the Society's collection is incredibly special, and we want everybody to know about that and appreciate it like we do. Jennifer and I consider ourselves very lucky. This is something that the Society has wanted to produce for many, many years. And we consider ourselves lucky that we're the ones who actually got to be so involved and do the writing. But we also would like to point out that it was, in fact, a lot of work. And this is what we looked like when we started. But although we seem to be the ones getting all the credit, we do know that a book of this nature is like a child and that it takes a village. And there were many, many people who were involved in this project and the catalog's production. I would like to thank all of them here, but we don't have time for that. So I'm just going to name a couple. First and foremost, I want to thank Richard Gruber of Wapiti, Wyoming, who's sitting here on the front row. Without his generous gift, this catalog would still be a dream for us. And so we are very thankful for what he's done for us. And without our very, very talented publication staff, Jennifer and I could have done all the research we wanted to do, and we wouldn't have a product like this to show for it. So we do thank all of them. I especially want to acknowledge Diane Hall, who is doubling as our videographer today. She's the book designer, and she just does an incredible job. I've looked at many, many art books over the years, and everything Diane designs is just first rate. And all of the publication staff, Glenda's here, Molly's our editor, Tammy and Christy, and really I did gain a lot of appreciation for how hard something like this is to pull together by working with them on this project. And also like to thank Tom Ferris, who is the Society's photographer. Up until we started working on the project, this is the kind of camera that Tom used. But thanks to Richard Gruber's generosity, one of the things we did, which will have a long-lasting benefit for the Society, is buy new high-tech digital equipment. All of the pictures of the Russell artwork that you've been looking at today were taken by Tom, and that's another reason that the book has turned out so beautiful, is the images are just incredible. Tom does a great job. the equipment certainly helped him with that. But when you do get a chance to see the catalog, there's lots of detail and that sort of thing that really makes a difference. If you don't believe me, I invite you to come back on next Thursday night, the 20th, at 6:30. Tom is going to be talking about his role in the production. And he has some really great slides that show the images that we did have before this all started and what his images look like. And finally, a lot of you might have been here for Bob Morgan's reception before this talk, but we did dedicate this book to Bob Morgan, who has been involved in the society professionally. I mean, as a curator beginning in the 1950s. Before that, he was a frequent visitor as a child. When his father was making his deliveries in town, he would drop Bob off at the Capitol, and Bob remembers the days when the society was still in the basement of the Capitol. So I think he probably goes back farther than anyone and has done more than anyone for the society. So it's with great appreciation, admiration, and affection that we dedicate this book to Bob and his wife, Jen. So I think that's the kind of the conclusion of the formal part of this, unless Jennifer has something else she wants to say.
No, I just thank you, Kirby, for all that. And although the books are not here, there are a couple of advanced copies available for people to thumb through and get a feel for what will shortly be available.
And you now have two choices. We can stay here and answer questions, or you can go to the lobby and eat cake. So that's, or we can all go to the lobby and